Good afternoon, everyone, and this is Marty Duckenfield with the National Dropout Prevention Center, and I'm here with my host and colleague, Dr. Beth Reynolds, Director of the National Dropout Prevention Center. We're just back from our national conference, and the adrenaline is still flowing. We are so excited about joining with everyone for today's program. The fun just keeps going on, doesn't it, Beth? And so we welcome all of you to this monthly radio webcast brought to you by the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson University and in partnership with Clemson Radio Productions and the generous support of Catapult Learning and Penn Foster.
Marty, I can't believe it's been a month since our last broadcast, but it is so great to be back for another program of solutions to the dropout crisis. We appreciate all of our loyal listeners out there and also want to take this opportunity to welcome any new listeners to the program. Today's promises to be a very informative hour. I really looked at today's title and said, wow, expecting success. And we're going to be talking about pregnant teens. It's really something to think, of the irony in that pun. And it really points in a way to a sad reality. But the flip side of that is if we do expect success, how that can change the whole way we approach the challenge of helping pregnant and parenting kids achieve success.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I really, really like that title. And that issue related to female dropouts could not be more compelling. You know, last month we were looking at teaching children of poverty. And one of the sure ways that keep that cycle of poverty going is the high rate of teenage pregnancy and subsequent dropouts. So we are delighted to have Lara Kaufmann with us today and what will prove to be an exceptional program. So, hey, let's get started. Now, first of all, I would like to remind our listeners of the materials that we provide for you on the website. And here we go. Number one is that slide presentation. This is a PowerPoint, as it were, to support today's discussion. Have that open and ready. It's in PDF format, so you will need to move your slides. The recent report, A Pregnancy Test for Schools, which is a must-read after this program if you haven't had a chance to review it beforehand. We've got some really good links here. Thanks to the National Women's Law Center. They have some excellent resources to support today's program. And finally, we did an interview with Lara earlier this month, and so that kind of in a brief form frames the issue that we're going to be discussing today. So, as usual, great resources for our topic and in all kinds of formats.
You're so right, Marty. Again, one of our strengths to these programs is the depth and quality of the materials provided by our presenters to enhance this whole experience. And today will absolutely not be an exception.
Right. You know, the wonderful thing about these webcasts is that you, the listeners, have the opportunity to engage in discussion with our presenters. So we invite you to be an active part of the program today, and there are two ways you can connect to us. This is a radio call-in show, so we encourage you to call your questions into our guest. You can have a discussion with her. Our toll-free call-in number is 888-539-8859, and if you're calling from outside the U.S., the number is 864-656-4549. Now, you can begin calling anytime during the program, and we'll put you on hold for a few minutes, but we're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can during the broadcast. You know, as an added benefit for today's program, if you call in, we'll send you a free copy of one of our Effective Strategies publications. You just give Eric your name and email address and phone number when you call in.
And like last year, your name will go in a hat for a chance to win a free conference registration to next year's conference, the National Dropout Prevention Conference that will be held next year in Atlanta, Georgia, November the 3rd through the 6th. We will be collecting those names after each of these programs, and we'll do the drawing at our final program in the spring.
That is always such a great prize. You know, it was terrific to have this year's winner at the Orlando conference this past week. Carl White came all the way from Alaska, and we hope you're listening again today, Carl, but it was great to have you come. We also accept email questions sent to our email address, which is ndpc@clemson.edu, with the word solutions in the subject line. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as well. You know, as always, we're looking forward to the calls and questions from our audience.
We are. All right, just to get to it, our topic this month, again, is expecting success from pregnant and parenting students, the law, and promising practices. So joining us today from Washington, D.C., is our friend and colleague, Lara Kaufmann, Senior Counsel and Director of Education Policy for At-Risk Students at the National Women's Law Center. Lara co-authored the center's 2012 report entitled A Pregnancy Test for Schools, The Impact of Educational Laws and Pregnant and Parenting Students. Lara, we are delighted to have you with us with all your expertise today.
Thank you.
When we look at the causes of female dropouts, one of the major reasons that girls drop out is due to pregnancy and then the parenting duties that follow. This is clearly a very significant issue and one that we should not sweep under the carpet. Rather, we need to become better informed about it and its implications. We need to analyze what efforts are successful, both from a policy and practice viewpoint, and we need to use these solutions to address this crisis for girls. I really believe today's program is an extremely important one, so Lara, let's get to it. And be sure to call us with your questions, and that number again is toll-free, 888-539-8859. And for those of you calling outside the U.S., the number is 864-656-4549. Lara, why don't we open up those slides now? I'll let you get started. Begin to share your expertise with our listeners.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for being here. It's really wonderful to talk to a diverse group about this subject because it's something I think that often gets overlooked, and we always at the National Women's Law Center are trying to bring more and more attention to the plight of girls in school, and particularly those who are pregnant and parenting. If you turn to the second slide in the presentation, you'll see a little overview of what I think we will cover today. We're going to briefly talk about girls in the dropout crisis generally, and then talk more specifically about teen pregnancy and parenting and how that affects educational outcomes, some of the barriers to success that pregnant and parenting students face, what Title IX requires, and state laws that are relevant, and then some recommendations about moving forward. On the next slide, you'll see some statistics about girls and the dropout crisis generally. So over a quarter of girls don't graduate from high school on time, if at all. And for girls of color, the rates are even worse. Only 44% of Native American and Alaskan Native girls graduate on time, if at all. The same is true for 34% of Latinas and 35% of African American girls. Those are their graduation rates. That's the rate for Native American, Alaskan Native girls, for Latinas, and for African American girls are much higher than the rates for white girls, the rates for all girls, and the rates for all boys. So it's not something we want to ignore just because girls are graduating at higher rates than boys. There's still a long way to go. Moving to the next slide, it says, when girls don't graduate, we all fail. This was the title of a report we issued in 2007, focusing on the dropout crisis for girls specifically, because at that time, almost everything that we saw in the media, in the public, was focused on the dropout crisis as one for boys. Turns out that girls who fail to graduate from high school have higher rates of unemployment and make significantly lower wages than male dropouts. So there's a wage gap at every level of education, but that gap is the widest for dropouts. And girls who don't graduate are far more likely than boys who don't graduate to be unemployed. 1 out of every 2 female high school dropouts is unemployed, and you can see a statistic here from 2006 comparing the employment rate of adult male dropouts to their female peers, and there's a huge gap there. The next slide focuses on teen pregnancy more specifically. So the rates in the U.S. are higher than those of any other industrialized country. In this country, nearly 3 in 10 girls get pregnant at least once by the age of 20. And for women of color, those rates are higher. More than half of Latinas and more than half of black young women become pregnant before age 20. With those rates, it's really something we can't ignore. We need to focus on, solutions, as this webcast is called, not just to addressing teen pregnancy, which certainly should be a priority and is a very important piece of this, but also accommodating the needs and helping those who do get pregnant and do have babies to stay in school and succeed. The next slide is titled Pregnancy as a Motivator, and I just thought it would be helpful to share this because of the stereotypes that are out there. A lot of people think that pregnant students are losers and are going to end up dropping out anyway, so why invest any time in them? But studies have shown otherwise. Most teens that become mothers really talk about how they find renewed motivation to stay in school, assuming they were disengaged before they got pregnant, which is the case for many of them. And they really want to do well by their children. They want to be able to offer their children a good future. They know that education is key to that. And unfortunately, a lot of times, many of them face barriers that make it impossible for them to stick to it and succeed, even though they know that that would be best for them. And so we really want to focus on how to address those barriers and how to ensure they have the support and encouragement they need. When you look at the next slide, you'll see some data on graduation rates for pregnant and parenting students, but it's not the kind of data we'd like to see. To be honest, there's not enough data out there. A lot of schools are not keeping track of their pregnant and parenting students and how they're faring in school. We have been making recommendations at the federal level that data be collected in a way, of course, that would not compromise student privacy. But we think it's really important, as it is for any risk factor, that we know the scope of the problem. But the Gates Foundation did a survey a few years ago, and they surveyed female dropouts across the country. Almost 1/2 of them said becoming a parent was a factor in their decisions to leave school. 1/3 said it was a major factor. And it was a factor for males, too, just to a lesser extent. But it was interesting is that the females and males who dropped out because they became a parent or because of family responsibilities was the group most likely to say that they would have stayed in school if their schools had demanded more of them and provided them with the necessary support. And so that's really key information and something that we want to really take to heart. The next slide talks about the educational outcomes a little more specifically. The group called Child Trends did a study looking at the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 2007 cohort, and they did an analysis that showed that only half of women who were teen mothers ended up earning their high school diplomas by age 22, and 1 in 3 earned neither a diploma nor a GED by age 22. And unfortunately, another study showed that less than 2% of young teen mothers, which is defined as teen mothers under the age of 18, got their college degree by age 30. So I want to take a moment to stop here in case there are any questions before we launch into the barriers, the specific barriers these students face.
Well, Laura, we do have a phone call, and though Beth and I probably have some discussion points we wanted to go to, we always like, I'm sorry, they didn't give me a message. We have someone who's listening because her computer isn't working well, so we're glad you're listening. So we can go to our questions then. But so, Beth, did you have something that you wanted to kind of comment on? I know I do, but go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to comment on is what we know when Lara was saying what the educational outcomes were, with 51% of the women who were teen mothers not earning their diplomas by age 22, and still 1 in 3 neither diploma nor GED, and she went on with those statistics. What immediately comes to my mind is what we at the National Dropout Prevention Center know to be the consequences of that. And it's consequence from so many vantage points. Obviously, it impacts that person's ability to find work and to live a satisfying life. But it also has incredible impact on economically on that individual and their ability to earn dollars, as well as on our economy. So I guess my point is, the statistics don't lie. The statistics tell us what's going on in the arena of pregnant teens. And it's just so important that we do highlight those programs that are impacting that in positive ways and finding strategies that make a difference, because if we don't, the consequences are dire in so many arenas.
That's right. And the educational outcomes, as you know, of mothers have an impact on the educational outcomes of their children. So, the more we do to invest in this population of students, the more return we're going to see with the next generation.
I mean, I'm someone who always likes to go look at the cause of things to kind of deal with what a problem is. And if you go down to this cause of poverty, this is a huge factor. And it's one that really seems to me like a no-brainer to address. And as the world becomes more sophisticated and complicated, there are less and less opportunities for people who are not well-educated, male or female, and to have such a significant group who are teen mothers raising children. It's that cycle of poverty thing. And so I see that this is such a huge thing. We do have someone, I think, calling in with a question. Am I correct? It's okay. They're just getting her information so she can, she wants to go to the conference, Beth. They got to get her email and phone number first.
Excellent.
But I just think that whole issue of the cycle of poverty is the thing that just strikes me. This is a very compelling issue, and so we're going to be talking about the next step in a minute. But once we have Beth online here, we can get to her questions. And if you had any comment before we do that, Lara, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of what we need to do in the debates about education reform is really take into account what can be done for this population of students. I think that's something that I don't hear discussed a lot in Washington, although I try to put it on the agenda. I think there are some concrete things that we can do, and I look forward to getting into that a little more. But I want to make sure that, just like any other group of at-risk students, that there are resources dedicated to this group of students, because some of their needs are different from the needs of other at-risk students, but they are concrete and tangible, and we do know anecdotally what works, even if we don't have the kind of data that I'd like to see.
I think that's such a good point about dropout prevention. One size does not fit all in our schools, or and as far as solutions to the myriad of issues that young people are facing today. And now, we have Beth, who is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, calling in with a question or comment. Beth, for Lara, welcome to the program.
Thank you. This is my first time listening. I'm really gaining from it. I do have a question, Lara. You said earlier that a lot of schools are not keeping track of pregnant and parenting teens, so it's hard to get the data. And I've often wondered about that, because I coordinate student assistance at our school, and we do track. We're from a virtual school, so we struggle to track. We track only by disclosure because we don't see the students face to face. But I've often wondered where I would report our numbers and things like that. Is there a place that I should be reporting them, or is there a movement toward that?
Well, it depends on what state you're in. I mean, I understand that there are a few states that keep track of this information, but the vast majority don't. They don't have any systemized way of keeping track, and there's no federal requirement that that data be tracked the way there is for other types of data. I think it would be great if you could encourage at least your school and maybe even your district to start to keep track of that data in an organized manner. I think there are some steps that would have to be taken to ensure student privacy, but that's certainly manageable. There are other contexts in which data is collected. For example, under the Perkins Career and Technical Education Law, there's data collected about single parents, and that data is dependent on self-reporting, but I do think students would report if they knew that they would get assistance by coming forward. And I do think schools know a lot more than sometimes they admit to knowing about who's pregnant and who's not. So I don't know who to tell you to report that to in your individual situation, but I do think it's great if you could figure out a system. There are probably very different ways to have it done. It could be collected by whoever manages all the data at school. It could be the school nurse. It could be somebody else. I'm really interested to hear the different ways that folks are doing it.
Right. Well, and I do collect the data. I'm the person that does that, but I'm trying to figure out, and I have numbers and things like that, male, female, and things of disclosures, obviously, but I'm just wondering if there's a national place to report without names, obviously. So
right.
At this point,
unfortunately, sorry about that. My sound
okay.
has been a little bit in and out, so I didn't hear everything you said.
Sorry.
But yeah, that I wish there were. There isn't currently, but I'm working on it. That's all I can say.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate your time. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beth. And you do bring up an important issue that I know we're going to talk about even more after a few other sections, I think, coming up. And so we're ready to move on to the next section. I think you've made the point quite clearly that it would be a really good idea to help these students succeed, to break the cycle of poverty, give them opportunities for success, and so forth. But perhaps the barriers we're going to discuss, in my mind, they reflect the whole idea of low expectations. Because if you have low expectations, these barriers emerge, and it's just putting that lens on, based on that great title that Beth and I like of your presentation today, kind of frames this in a kind of way. So let's move on to looking, what are those barriers to graduation that you're seeing out there? So slide 9 lists very briefly the different barriers that I've tried to group them into different categories. If you go on to the next slide, we'll start with the environment of discouragement. A lot of students describe a shift in the way they're treated at school when their pregnancy is discovered. Some of them feel like teachers, who don't approve are treating them as if they're a lost cause. Some school officials do directly discourage students by encouraging that they drop out and get their GED instead of staying in high school. Sometimes they're harassed in school, being called a slut or a whore, getting questions about their sexual activity or who's parenting their child, etc. In general, there's a lack of support and a lack of encouragement, and there are still very prevalent stereotypes about girls who get pregnant out of wedlock, and those stereotypes can be internalized by the student, which just discourages them further. And, you and I know that if you don't believe you can succeed, it's a lot more likely that you won't succeed. So it's really important to turn that around. The next slide shows some of the other discriminatory barriers that students face. Punitive absence policies is a big one. We get a lot of calls about this at the National Women's Law Center. Some states, most states, don't have a clear policy on absences for pregnant and parenting students. There are some who do, but even if this policy doesn't directly address pregnant and parenting students, it should still be an excused absence, anything pregnancy related. So we're talking about doctor's appointments, bed rest, childbirth, recovery, etc.
the issue of children's illnesses is slightly different. It's not addressed directly by Title IX, and we'll get in a minute, we'll get to what Title IX requires. But as a matter of educational policy, it's great. We see schools that are excusing absences related to the illness or medical appointment of a student's child, and that could be such a help, because if they don't, and a student's child gets sick and has to be out of daycare for a week, very quickly that student could have accrued enough absences to be truant, and we all know where that goes. So it's really important that schools work with these students and try to accommodate their needs. The other problem that I highlight on this slide is the separate programs that are not equal. So schools don't have to provide separate programs for pregnant and parenting students, but if they do, they have to be equal to the programs that the students would be in their mainstream schools. And when I say equal, they don't have to be exactly the same, but they have to be of equal quality and provide the same sorts of educational benefits. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, that's not what's happening. Separate isn't equal. And, we see that a lot with alternative schools, too. Some of these programs are dead-end programs, and students don't end up transitioning from them back into mainstream schools. They don't end up getting credits and graduating the way they should be. The best example of that is highlighted on the next slide. New York City, until 2007, had a group of schools they called Peace Schools, and they were specifically for pregnant and parenting students. But you look at the statistics here, the average daily attendance was only 47%. Less than half of the students transitioned back into a mainstream high school, and those students were not earning credits. They were not on track to graduate. They weren't getting any college readiness skills or even career skills. And so a New York Times reporter that visited found a bunch of girls sewing a quilt, and says that is what passes for math in one of New York City's 4 high schools for pregnant girls. It ties into geometry, the principal said. They're cutting shapes. And that, to me, just, is the most stark example of some of the challenges that come with separating out students of one group or another. The next slide talks about homebound services. Practically speaking, there's usually some period of time during which pregnant and parenting students can't get to school. And states don't have to offer homebound services, but if they do, they have to make them available equally to pregnant and parenting students. So we have found problems in states where the law explicitly said pregnancy is not an eligible condition for homebound, and that violates Title IX. North Carolina has a state statute that requires schools to offer homebound and online learning to students whose children are ill or who can't come to school because they don't have child care, and that's really a step in the right direction. That's more progressive than most states. The next slide talks about child care and transportation, and these, logistical barriers are more obvious. Without dependable, affordable, quality child care, you can't, practically speaking, come to school, and care tends to be very expensive. In many places, it's not readily available, and in many states, it's illegal for a child under the age of 5 to ride on a school bus, so transportation is an issue as well. And the next slide highlights the lack of data that I was talking about before with our caller, and without better data, it is really hard to make the kind of data-driven decisions to invest in what we know works. And so the more data we have, the better. And that is something, as I said, that we're pushing for at the federal level. And next, I was going to launch into Title IX and what it requires. So I want to pause for a second in case there are any questions about the barriers.
And we'll invite callers to our toll-free number, 888-539-8859. And also to send us an email, ndpc@clemson.edu. This might be a place where we could share some stories, Lara, about things that actually you have found out there in the world that have happened to students to prevent them from being successful and having opportunities to do well in school. And this is one of the things that I found interesting about that report that you have and that we have for our listeners online are some of the actual stories and situations, court cases and whatnot, that were caught in these barriers.
Absolutely. Well, some examples include places where they offered homebound instruction for students who are out of school for 5 or 10 consecutive days because of medical conditions, but did not allow pregnant students to take advantage of that. Until recently, that was the law. It was a state regulation both in Michigan and in Georgia, and we had to work through the rulemaking process in those states to get that rule changed because it violates Title IX. But, schools were routinely excluding students, pregnant parenting students, from benefiting from these services. We also represented a young woman whose principal suggested that she drop out and get a GED because it would be easier for her. She decided to stay in school and really wanted to stay in school. And while she was out recovering from childbirth for about 6 weeks, she wanted her work to be sent home, which makes good sense. Unfortunately, the school made it so difficult for her to get her work that she ended up falling terribly behind and failing a couple of classes. They wouldn't let her brother bring the work home. They wouldn't email it to her. They said she had to show up in person to get the work. She went in person to get the work, but of course had her baby with her because she couldn't get anybody to watch her newborn. And they said, you're not allowed to bring a baby on campus. You have to leave, come back another time. And so the barriers just kept popping up, and eventually she gave up. And, sadly, that student has since dropped out of school. But, those are some really stark examples. And there's another one from the news recently you may have heard about. A school in Louisiana said that anybody suspected of being pregnant had to be tested. And, that's a clear violation of Title IX. And anyone that tested positive for pregnancy had to do homebound and couldn't come to class anymore. So some are blatant and some are more subtle, and some are things that girls wouldn't know are illegal. They wouldn't know to challenge, especially when they aren't empowered, they're in a position, they're a teenager who's pregnant, and they have so many barriers they're facing. But they really are violations of the law.
When we had our discussion earlier this month, which is online for people to listen to, we talked about this, and oftentimes it's well-meaning adults who don't want to condone what has happened. And so a lot of their attitudes come from that, and that perhaps by condoning it, they're going to encourage special treatment for... We talked about that issue about, is it going to go viral if the school doesn't come down hard on pregnant teens?
Right. Well, that is a myth, and we do hear that a lot, but it hasn't proven to be true. And my favorite example is the high school in Texas that has a program for pregnant and parenting students on site in the mainstream high school. And I asked the assistant superintendent why she decided to have it on site instead of in a separate facility. And she said she wanted to dispel that myth that having pregnant students around is going to make other students want to get pregnant. It hasn't had that effect. Not only have they seen the graduation rates of their pregnant and parenting students go up, but they've seen their teen pregnancy rates in their school go down. And so I just think that's, something we're going to have to, that attitude we're going to have to change.
Lara, as I'm sitting here listening to you, and I go back to that last statement you just made, because in your report, I think the one thing that stood out the most for me is for you saying where the researchers have found that when they do open up high-quality programs to these teen mothers that do have accommodations that meet their unique needs, when that happens, it leads to graduation rates for them that are close to that of other non-pregnant peers. And so when, you've outlined a great list of the particular issues that pregnant teens have that other students don't face. So this kind of loops back to Beth's call earlier. Ideally, it would be great if at the federal level or the state level, we had groups that were enacting some policies that required schools to pay attention to that. But at the same time, I'm thinking, local districts could choose to open up some opportunities to accommodate what they know are the unique barriers for pregnant teens, because they truly should not have to postpone their education because they're pregnant. We know the statistics say that once they get into that and have children, most of them don't come back. So we need to catch them while we can.
That's right. And some of the best policies we've seen are at the district level. There's a lot that districts can do to change the way their schools treat pregnant and parenting students. And so, while change is great at the federal and state level, that can sometimes be slower. And certainly there's a lot that districts can do, and even individual schools.
And I think we're talking about policies and things like that. We can move now to the next section. And this is the 40th anniversary of Title IX. And look at that, 1972. And as I've said to you before, Lara, I always thought Title IX had to do with sports and women's sports, and you have set me right and taught me much. And so I want you to kind of share some of that with our listeners now so we can see why we are talking about this issue as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Title IX.
So Title IX, and you'll see this on slide 16, is very broad in scope. It's one sentence, it's not very many words, but it says that sex discrimination in schools or educational programs that receive federal funding is prohibited. And that is broad, and it's purposefully broad. And so it includes discrimination in athletics, because that is an educational opportunity, and that is very important, and that's what Title IX is most known for. But it also includes the sexual harassment that we see a lot in schools. That's prohibited. Counseling students differently on career paths based on their sex is prohibited. Denying girls access to high-level science or math courses is prohibited. Steering girls to certain vocational education classes, career and tech classes, is prohibited, and so is discrimination based on pregnancy. The Title IX is very general, as I said, but there is also a set of regulations that govern the treatment of pregnant and parenting students, and slide 17 summarizes those. Students have to have equal access to school and activities. They should not be required to provide a doctor's note for continued participation in school unless that's done for all students who experience medical conditions. The presumption needs to be that girls can stay in school and fully participate even once they become pregnant, not the other way around. And unfortunately, we see schools put the burden on students. They get worried about, that these students are somehow fragile and cannot stay in school and attend as normal. And that's not the case at all. Absent extraordinary circumstances, students should be able to attend. Any special programs or schools for pregnant and parenting students have to be voluntary and of equal quality, that we already discussed. The regulation actually says that any absences related to pregnancy, and I should clarify here that it's not just pregnancy, it's any related medical condition, pregnancy, miscarriage, termination of pregnancy, childbirth, or recovery from any of those conditions. Any absences related to those things have to be excused for as long as a student's doctor says it's medically necessary. And that's one I think schools really miss the boat on because, understandably, they want to get students back in school. And I recognize that tension because I do a lot of work on trying to improve graduation rates for at-risk girls. And I know that the longer students are out, the less likely they'll return. But a student who's forced to come back before she's ready and physically able to participate may also drop out and won't do well. So it's important that schools defer to the judgment of the student and her doctor while still encouraging the student to come back and doing the kind of outreach that I know the National Dropout Prevention Center recommends, reaching out to students who are out and making sure that they know a caring adult at school wants them to return. Students, in order to make those absences truly excused, need to be given a reasonable amount of time to make up the work they miss, and we need to ensure that they aren't penalized for missing that time. So the regulation says that at the conclusion of their leave, they need to be returned to the status they held before the leave began. And then the last is, like I said about homebound instruction, it goes for any services that are provided to temporarily disabled students. Those have to be offered on an equal basis to pregnant and parenting students. And slide 18 gives some examples of violations, and we did talk about this already briefly. I'll just add a couple more examples. There are schools that don't allow students to be in an honor society or run for homecoming court or senior superlatives, don't want them to walk at graduation because it would set a bad example. And those are really harmful practices. They may not seem major, but those are the kinds, depriving students of the kinds of activities that keep them connected to school, that keep them feeling positive about school, can be very harmful. And we feel the same way about participation in athletics and other extracurricular activities. And there have been a series of federal court cases about the exclusion of pregnant students or students who at one point have been pregnant from honor societies. And the courts have said not only is that a potential problem under Title IX, but also it could violate the U.S. Constitution, because the Equal Protection Clause says that men and women have to be treated equally. And those schools that are excluding students who were pregnant because of quote unquote immoral conduct, because they were engaging in premarital sex, which is often their defense. They say, oh, we weren't discriminating because she was pregnant. We're just discriminating because the National Honor Society requires good moral character, and premarital sex doesn't fit with that. Well, the judges have said, did you ask all the males in the Honor Society whether they have engaged in premarital sex? And of course, the answer is always no. But these are some more examples here.
Yeah.
And
Larry,
if I
could,
report, so I'm happy to take questions about Title IX specifically if folks have any.
Yeah, and if I can interject a minute before we look and see where we have any questions. You know, you have made some very clear points about what Title IX requires, and absolutely there are always court cases about people who violate that, and I'm glad they come to light. At the same time, I'm looking at the flip side of that, because I'm sure listening out there are some wonderful school leaders and district leaders and even state leaders who are trying to do the right thing for those girls. I know there's some states that have enacted legislation that requires us to pay attention to that. I guess my point here is that some of what you said I think is a key point today for any of our listeners that have impact on the state accountability systems. Because I know now with the new accountability systems, they're bringing in the piece about absenteeism. And schools need leverage to be able to build into those formulas what you're asking them to accommodate. And we're all asking them to accommodate for these girls because they need it. So those accountability formulas absolutely need to be written to allow that to happen and not be so rigid.
Yeah, I agree. There has to be some flexibility. Otherwise, you get back to one size fits all, which of course isn't true.
That's very true.
Now, I think one of the things I read in that report, which I read a few weeks ago, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that part of Title IX required school districts to have a coordinator to make sure that the school is in compliance with Title IX. Could you address that? Because is that happening? I mean, is that true? And if so, is it happening, or what are you seeing out there?
It is true, and unfortunately, it's not happening as widely as it should. That's been a requirement since back in the early 70s when Title IX was passed. Every recipient of federal funding is supposed to designate a Title IX coordinator. Now, it doesn't have to be somebody's full-time job to be the Title IX coordinator, but there needs to be somebody designated, and schools have to publicize who that person is. In some states, there is both a state-level Title IX coordinator, a district-level Title IX coordinator, and individuals designated in the school buildings. And that's what we recommend as a best practice, because then the students are familiar with who that person is, they recognize that person, and they know where to go with complaints. But the role of the Title IX coordinator is supposed to be somebody who oversees compliance with Title IX and possibly takes complaints, helps to investigate or oversee the investigation of complaints, and communicates with the district level and the state level about Title IX compliance. That's really one of the the benefit of the system, if it's working properly, if it's being implemented, is that the communication between the different levels really helps to ensure that things are happening the way they're supposed to be happening on the ground. Unfortunately, many schools have not designated someone. It doesn't have to be a person at the school level. They can notify their students and parents and teachers of who it is at the district level that they should contact. But many districts also have not appointed Title IX coordinators, and some states haven't even appointed Title IX coordinators. And that's a violation. But the other problem there is that the system breaks down when you don't have that communication. If students don't know what their rights are and don't know who to report to, if their rights are being violated, then what good is the law? The other piece is that there needs to be good training for Title IX coordinators, because some people who are appointed, if they don't know very much about Title IX, they won't know what to look for. They won't be able to train their teachers and staff members about what to look for. And it's very important, particularly when you think about things like pregnancy discrimination or sexual harassment, that the adults in the building be very aware of what's going on and what's prohibited.
Well, this sounds like an example of a well-intended law that's not being implemented as thought, and it's a key position, and for schools who don't have them and don't know they're supposed to have them, that's, to me, is of concern. And if you are such a person and there's not a lot of connections with others and administrative-wise, and to even know where to start, that's of concern. So that's an interesting area that needs to be pursued. But, Beth and I, we've had lots of questions. We've got a caller, and we need to open up our lines to share this conversation with Teresa, who's calling from Tucson, Arizona. So welcome to Solutions, Teresa. And do you have a question or comment for our presenter today?
Well, I have a question. I'm a graduate candidate or doctoral candidate, and I'm doing research in alternative schooling for at-risk and students who have dropped out. And I used to do recruiting for Job Corps. And as an alternative school, and also funded by the federal government, one of the problems I had about getting girls signed up was that they were parenting, they were mothers, and they had to have a signed contract with a child care provider before they could even be approved to go to school at Job Corps to finish up their high school. And they could either pay for this out of pocket, or they could borrow on the funds that Job Corps provides as a bonus for everyone who finishes. And I felt like this was really unfair, because if you don't have a child and you're not paying child care, that little bonus at the end is kind of a nice little bonus to help you get started in the adult world, like, down payment on a car or whatever. And to me, it just kind of seemed to penalize the women. Is this fair under Title IX?
You're talking, just to clarify, about a special stipend that students get when they finish the program that you can't get unless you prove that you have child care? Is that what you're saying?
No. The thing is, before you can even start at Job Corps, you have to have a signed contract with the individual that's going to be providing child care, whether it's a family member, a friend, or whether you have found affordable daycare somewhere in town.
Right.
However, if you can't, Job Corps makes provisions for mothers to pay for this out of a bonus that they get, that all students get when they finish.
I see what you're saying. And so the impact is really only on mothers who have to spend it on something else besides. Well, it's very interesting because Title IX doesn't require that schools provide child care for students, but that is just another barrier that these students face. And I know that there have been challenges in Job Corps. This isn't the first thing I've heard about Job Corps having some barriers for pregnant and parenting students. So I'm interested and I want to learn more, maybe you can contact me after the call. My contact information is at the end of the slides. But I do think that it's an example of a practice that seems to be neutral on its face, but has a disproportionate impact on one population of students. And it does seem to be a problem if they're offering a benefit to all of their students, but one group of students really can't take advantage of it in the same way because they have other expenses they have to cover with that. So it's something I'd love to explore further. I think you're onto something. Without knowing more, though, it's hard to say one way or another whether that would be a problem under Title IX.
Okay, I'll be sure to contact you.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, and thanks for calling in, Teresa, and we appreciate your comments, and you and Lara are going to have a conversation after the program. Very good. Okay, I think we're ready to move on, looking at the clock and looking at what's coming up next.
Well, thanks. The next slide is slide 19, which shows the cover of our recent report. And what we did for this report is we looked at state laws and policies for all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and D.C. And we tried to look at what laws are on the books that help pregnant and parenting students succeed, what laws are there that may hurt pregnant and parenting students or stand in the way of their success, and what are states doing, if anything, to try to support this population and provide them with the kinds of support and encouragement they need. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we found some examples where states were really making great efforts to put in place evidence-based programs and curricula that improve educational outcomes for pregnant and parenting students. California, Pennsylvania, and Florida were the top three, and we saw an amazing statewide effort there with programs, with funding, and other types of supports. However, unfortunately, a lot of these programs have suffered from budget cuts, including, in particular, California and Pennsylvania. In California, the CalSafe program, which was their statewide program, was cut by 19%, and the state eliminated the office that monitored compliance and collected data. And similarly, in Pennsylvania, there was the ELECT program, and that budget was cut by 16% recently. So that's very, very unfortunate. We also know, as I said, of some good district-level policies. Two in particular are the New York City Department of Education policy and the LA Unified School District policy. They, in response to pressure from advocates, they adopted very strong regulations about educational options for pregnant and parenting students. The New York City policy actually holds each school principal accountable for ensuring that pregnant and parenting students at his or her school get the services they need, including access to information about health care, child care, and other services. And they also include provisions about excused absences, make-up work, and homebound instruction, among other things. And LA has a very detailed policy, and one of the attachments is a Know Your Rights fact sheet for students in both English and Spanish, and it includes a very comprehensive list of resources for students. And the policy requires districts to make reasonable adjustments, in quotes, to facilitate the equal access and full participation of pregnant and parenting students. So that includes things as simple as hall passes for bathroom use, as pregnant and parenting students may need more than other students, arranging for independent study during an extended pregnancy-related absence, allowing scheduling flexibility when possible to reduce school absences, allowing a reduced schedule of classes for students with medical complications, that sort of thing. And the policy also covers school climate, attendance, enrollment, etc. So it's very comprehensive, and I recommend that folks take a look at that. Slide 21 talks about the big picture, what we found in our report. Overall, we found that no state has really put in place the full range of policies and programs that would help pregnant and parenting students. And, there is a lot of potential for improvement in every state. Fewer than half the states do things like explicitly making their homebound instruction services available to pregnant and parenting students. And almost half of states don't have any kind of statewide program, grant, or support that's designed specifically for pregnant and parenting students. So as I said, there's a lot of room for improvement. The next slide just shows you what the ranking looks like. In our report, we have two charts. One is like this that just ranks states overall on the different measures we looked at. And then there's another chart that focuses more specifically on the pregnant and parenting student program for the states that have those programs. So I encourage you to take a look at that. The next slide points something out that we all know, but I think bears repeating, which is that just because a state has a good policy or has a high ranking in our report doesn't mean that things are being implemented the way they should be. And we know that, and that's the big caveat to our report. We looked at what's on the books in different states, but we know that these kinds of laws and policies are only meaningful if they are implemented in the right way and those who implement them are trained and know what they're doing. And so, just like the fact that Title IX says pregnant and parenting students need certain accommodations, that doesn't mean that every pregnant student is actually getting it on the ground. And it also, the prohibition of discrimination doesn't mean that students aren't being discriminated against. And I would encourage all of you out there to contact us at the National Women's Law Center if you know of practices that either violate Title IX, that just don't seem fair, or that don't seem to comply with what your state or district requires, because oftentimes just pointing that out to school districts or schools can turn things around. It's not like we file a lawsuit in response to every story we hear, but there are things we can do to help and to help advocate. And the more stories we have about what's going on out there, the better we can advocate for legislation at the federal level, for Department of Education action, or even just for increased awareness amongst the public. So I really encourage you all to keep your eyes open and reach out if you do hear of something or know of something, and encourage others to do the same. Next, I wanted to turn to recommendations, but if there are
you will take a little pause
on
here.
The report, I will.
It looks like there might be a call coming in, but I was just wanting to comment on this one more time, and that is this publication, because there are some really useful pieces inside here, sample letters that you could write, things that the whole awareness of what is fair and what is required. And this will help people who are these back to the compliance coordinators again for Title IX to know what, in fact, they do have under their responsibility that is part of their domain. So did you think it was helpful, Beth? I mean, you're someone who's worked in schools at an administrative level. Wouldn't you find this helpful to provide for the relevant staff at your school?
I think it's helpful at any level. If you are a local school, I mean, Lara has clearly put in this publication some things that you could use as a checklist to see, are we doing accommodations for this? Are we doing accommodations for that? Same's true at the district level, but then I think at the state level, there are some pieces here in terms of with some policy implications. How could we ease the burden on local schools and districts to allow them better to be able to accommodate what we know needs to happen to encourage these girls to stay in school?
And I think we really appreciate the work of your organization to provide this support, because it's clearly a huge issue and some that people just don't have a lot of information about. We have time for one more caller, and we have someone calling from Bradenton, Florida, with a wonderful name of Jomaira, and I hope I've said your name right, Jomaira.
It's actually Jemira.
Jemira, but it's a beautiful name, and we appreciate your calling in. So let's get right to it. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I may just not be too well versed with the parenting piece of this, but are the male students being included, and is there research on the policies that might be in place or practices that some school districts across the nation might be using to help them out in any cases where the male or the father is the one actually doing the parenting?
You know, Jamira, thank you for raising that because that's an excellent point. I forgot to mention that Title IX applies equally to males and females, and we certainly want to encourage the involvement of young fathers as much as possible in the lives of their families and, also ensure that they can stay in school and graduate because that's best for everyone. So there are some policies and not so much policy, I should take that back. There are some programs out there geared toward teen fathers, and there are also schools that are providing services that they make available equally to teen fathers. And we tell folks that if you are providing, obviously males don't get pregnant, but if you are providing services to your parenting students, you need to make those services equally accessible to your male parents. And we think that's critical. In some cases, the fathers of students' children aren't in school, but to the extent they are in school, it really, really does help to give them the same kinds of support and guidance. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much for answering that, because like I said, I wasn't too well versed on the parenting portion of it and wasn't sure if the males are included. So Title IX does extend to them, and that's something that we should make our students aware of. Great.
Yeah, Title IX in every aspect applies to males and females. So when we're talking about athletic opportunities or sexual harassment or any other sorts of stereotypes that could be at play, it's the same goes for males, and we don't want to limit their educational opportunities either based on their sex. So, it's important to keep that in mind.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jamira. Great clarification there. Thank you very much, both Jamira and Lara. So we're going to the exciting part of the program because we are solutions. We're looking at recommendations as the next stage. So, Lara, back to you.
Thank you. Slide 25 starts with our recommendations at the federal level, and I won't spend too much time on this, but basically we really want the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education to shine a light on this issue. There's a lot they can be doing. They need to remind school districts and schools of their obligations under Title IX in this area in particular, since so few folks realize that Title IX applies here. They need to instruct schools and districts to review their policies and bring them into compliance if they're not in compliance. And they should require the training of staff members and even provide examples of promising practices where they could do that. They also could be conducting proactive compliance reviews so they could identify barriers and improve compliance with Title IX. There are also, folks can file complaints with OCR if they think there's a violation, and we have filed some complaints with OCR. But OCR also has its own independent authority to investigate when they suspect there may be violations. So they could be more proactive about that, and I think they've done that in other Title IX areas, but this is one that's really ripe for some intervention. And there are programs, there are things Congress can do to provide support for these sorts of programs. And one bill in particular that we've been advocating for is the Pregnant and Parenting Students Access to Education Act. It would create a grant program so that states and local school districts could get funds to provide targeted support to pregnant and parenting students. And it's quite broad in terms of the discretion that it provides districts in terms of how they spend those funds. There are some required uses, but many more allowable uses of funds. And districts are instructed to do a local needs assessment and figure out what are the needs in their area, what are the resources that could be leveraged in their area, and how to best address the needs of their students. So slide 26 focuses more on states and what states could be doing. States could be creating statewide definitions of excused absences that not only excuse pregnancy-related absences, but also excuse absences for students whose children are sick or have medical appointments and can't attend school. That's already law in North Carolina. It could be a law in many more places. States can establish standards for the programs that they provide for pregnant and parenting students so that they are of good quality. They do offer rigorous academic options. And they can also require schools to offer those programs or require districts to offer them, because that is something that certainly would help, because I think a lot of schools, if given the choice, may not choose to invest in this population, but there are a lot of places where there are very high rates of teen pregnancy and parenting, and I think schools need that added encouragement. They could also pass specific education laws and regulations that protect pregnant and parenting students to complement Title IX. And, states can implement professional development programs that focus on this. They can ensure coordination and planning, so they could designate someone at the state level to oversee the education of pregnant and parenting students and ensure that each district has a liaison, and then coordinate amongst those liaisons so that all the way down at the school level, these students are really getting the attention they deserve. They could also provide funding for educational services for pregnant and parenting students, or other kinds of services that are important to education but not necessarily strictly academic, like healthcare referrals, etc. And they can set a tone and improve the school climate for pregnant and parenting students to make sure that they can succeed and stay in school with confidence. The next slide talks about schools and districts more specifically, and obviously there are school level policies or district level policies that can be changed. Each school and district should designate a Title IX coordinator. They can create resources and trainings. They can educate and advertise so students know what their rights are. Teachers know what students' rights are. And there's a toolkit, as Marty mentioned, at the end of our report, and the link is right here on this slide, that provides a number of resources local officials can use. There's a fact sheet for schools on the rights of pregnant and parenting students. There is a pregnant and parenting students Bill of Rights wallet card that students can cut out and carry with them so they know what their rights are and what to do if they're experiencing discrimination. There is a list of sample pregnant and parenting student policies with links to those policies, and there's a sample letter to schools or districts that advocates can use to bring this issue to the attention of their schools in case there's a problem. So, there's a lot of other recommendations, helping these students with goal setting and guidance and encouragement, the same sorts of recommendations that we make for all at-risk students, but they do have a place here specifically with pregnant and parenting students. Individualized graduation plans would be helpful to these students, home instruction during maternity leave, assistance finding childcare and transportation. Another thing that I should mention here is secondary pregnancy prevention. Schools may assume that because students have been pregnant once that they don't need sex education, but in fact, it's really the contrary. And if students don't drop out after the first pregnancy, many of them are far more likely to drop out after a second or subsequent pregnancy. So we really encourage schools to make sure that students have access to the information they need and the resources they need to delay another pregnancy until after they've reached their educational goals. And obviously, access to social services is important. Another thing schools can do is, if they offer parenting classes, make those classes a little broader than just parenting skills. I think it's fabulous when schools offer parenting classes, because a lot of times, I think everybody should have to take parenting classes. I'm a parent myself and could use some help. But students in particular who are young and overwhelmed and juggling school with being a parent do need help in that area, but they also could teach a range of life skills such as budgeting, time management, networking, how to apply for colleges, how to apply to financial aid, how to interview for a job, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that schools could be doing is reaching out to dropouts or to students who had a baby and just haven't come back. I've heard from schools that some students disappear and they don't know why they aren't coming back, but they do know that the student had a baby. Well, clearly, that student is facing barriers to returning, whatever they may be, but reaching out to them and encouraging them to return and finding out what they need in order to return really would have an impact. So those are just a few examples, and there's others as well, but I hope that's helpful.
Oh, I think it's extremely helpful. a comment I was thinking of all along when we've just come from our conference where the schools and the districts that are winning these fine awards, they just do not accept that any student drops out. They will find them and do whatever it takes to make all students succeed. And targeting this particular audience is no different.
Right.
Lara,
that's exactly what we'd like to see more schools doing.
Wow. Lara, this session really has been so valuable and so informative. I suspect that many eyes out there have been opened up about the importance and the barriers and some of the potential solutions that we have out there to this incredibly important issue. I know it's something we'll want to follow up on in days to come.
Absolutely.
And if folks have questions, they should feel free to contact me because we do provide some technical assistance, and we really do appreciate being in touch with the challenges people are facing out there.
Oh, that's great. I did not realize you provided that, TA, so thank you for sharing that particular piece, too, Lara. My goodness. I think we've all learned a lot over the past hour plus here, and there's plenty to do, but what I really love is you've got it so nicely packaged in this report, which we're so happy to share with people. And we need to put a spotlight on this issue, and there is plenty for everybody to do, lots of good ideas. Wherever you come from, whether you are the parent, the student, the teacher, the coordinator, the administrator, the principal, there's just great ideas in here, and also the state level and how the states that are doing things. And I just think this is a fantastic piece to have, and you've done a lot of hard work putting it together, and now we're happy to help you share that information. This program today is really a terrific starting point for all of us to learn more about the importance of dealing with these issues and knowing that there are strategies that have been successful in meeting those concerns. Thank you from me.
Thank you so much for giving such attention to this issue because it is so important. And, I feel very strongly, but I really want to get the word out. So we really appreciate your help with that.
And Lara, I want to come back and say the same thing. I really do thank you on behalf of the Dropout Prevention Center and our listening audience. This has been an incredible program, and we do thank you for partnering with us. I think we've put a spotlight on a lot of facts around this incredibly important challenge. So hopefully beyond this point, we can go forward and have some breakthroughs with solutions to solve this.
That sounds great. Thank you.
At this point, I need to remind our listeners that this radio webcast, like all our monthly programs, will be archived on our website within the next few hours, and it's downloadable for your iPod or your MP3 players, so you can go back and listen again and again and again. And please recommend this to your friends and your colleagues. And, many people tell us they use these archive programs for professional development. They put that screen up on the wall, they get out the LCD projector, they put on the speakers, they gather the faculty or the staff or the community, and they have a professional development session with all these great resources. So we encourage you to do that. That has been our intent all along. And the other thing that I love, Beth, I have to say this every month, just in case there's a new listener, that we're on iTunes. You can actually subscribe to Solutions on iTunes, and then you get each month's program automatically.
Which is fabulous. Let me turn our attention for our listeners to what's coming up in November. In November, our guest is going to be our very own Karen Withington, who is a researcher on our staff, and she's been part of a 5-year research study that has looked at programs of studies. We know that Career Pathways is getting attention across states all over the country. So I think you're going to find this program to be very timely and incredibly valuable to you as you start getting into that work. So I, for one, am going to absolutely look forward to it. Thank you for all of you for listening and participating today. And remember that we know why students are dropping out of school. And with our research-based solutions, we can assure that all of our students graduate. Join us more for next time for Solutions to the Dropout Crisis.